Avoiding the sun is about as deleterious to your health as heavy smoking. So you kind of, at that point, start wondering whether complete sun avoidance is the answer.
Welcome to Skin as It Should Be, the podcast that takes an unfiltered look at skincare and the science behind it. With master chemist Trevor Steyn and creative professional Geoff Paton. In this episode, we'll find out why a lack of vitamin D weakens how your skin functions.
So for the last 50 years, a lot of the public health messaging has sold sunscreen as the defense against UV and skin cancer. So I guess it's one of the most widely accepted, public health messages in the whole world as truth. Do you think it should be?
So the thing is with sun exposure is that it's clear that overexposure is linked to aging. And it's also clear that sun exposure leads to the increase of some cancers, in particular solar keratoses. What's less clear is that, for example, melanoma is linked to sun exposure. It seems there's an increase, but it's questionable whether that increase is meaningful, large enough to warrant avoiding the sun. But I think overwhelmingly, the fact that sun's linked to an accelerated aging, excessive sun is linked to accelerated aging, and excessive sun is linked to some cancers. I think that doesn't necessarily logically follow that zero sun is the answer. And I think that's what's there's no incentive for people to promote the message of healthy sun exposure. There is a massive incentive to claim that it's deadly and that we need to purchase things like sunscreen. So there was a 2014 Swedish study, and it was a large number of women, and they looked at the women that avoided sun, and they had about twice the risk of death in the study period than people who had a healthy amount of sun. So avoiding the sun is about as deleterious to your health as heavy smoking. So you kind of, at that point, start wondering whether complete sun avoidance is the answer. And the fact is, obviously the vitamin D always comes up when it comes to sun, and it's really difficult to pass out whether it's vitamin D related or whether it's the actual sun exposure. Even with the current supplementation, most vitamin D comes from the sunlight, about 80% for most people. The thing is that that leads to this idea that it's only vitamin D that we need from sun. But the fact is that there are other mechanisms. When you're exposed to sunlight, you produce nitric oxide, and that dilates blood vessels and reduces heart attack and stroke risk. And there are also the longer wavelengths in sun, infrared. And that's been linked definitely to mitochondrial health and even improved physical performance, improved muscular performance. So it's not just the vitamin D story in sun, although that is a pretty chunky part of it.
Yeah. So studies in the UK and America show that between 50 and 70% of people are vitamin D deficient, which is a fairly hefty number. Do you think that the sun-safe education is partly to blame for this, or fully to blame?
Education by who? So I think you've got to look very carefully at who's doing the education. Is it governments? Or is it corporates, companies? Or is it governments at the behest of companies? So I think you've got to look quite carefully at who's driving the education and what their incentives are. But the fact is that the landscape seems finally to be changing a little. So in Australia, they have the world's highest skin cancer rates. There's a whole lot of very pale people living outside of the zone where they should be living in. So obviously skin cancer levels are high. And they've had their slip, slap, slop program since the early 80s already. And they've been driving zero sun exposure hard. And they've had to change tack recently. So now they're, for the first time, recommending healthy sun exposure, even for light-skinned people. So, yeah, I think the landscape's shifting. It looks like the UK might adopt the same public recommendation. Listen, I'm not saying there's no place for sunscreen, especially in a place like Australia if you evolved in Scandinavia. But yeah, I think just some measure of healthy sun exposure is starting to come through in the public messaging from government. I don't think there's a huge incentive for companies to shift that messaging. I think if they could, they'd have you wearing sunscreen to go to sleep at night just because your radio clock might irradiate you while
you're sleeping.
Yeah.
I guess that's the problem with any message that's framed as absolute, and we've seen that in the health sector quite a lot. It's much easier to have a message which says, don't do this, because I guess there's variables in the population. That obviously stops people from seeing the full picture.
Yeah, the thing with a lot of these messages, but even more so with sun exposure, is that the truth's very, very complex. It brings to mind that courtroom drama. I think it was Jack Nicholson or somebody who yelled, "You can't handle the truth." It's the fact is that giving public guidance on sun exposure is pretty fraught with complexity. So if you look at the things that influence how much sun you should get, obviously time of year is a big deal. So there's a massive difference between midday sun in summer and midday sun in winter. The time of the day is critical as well. I hear a lot of people going, I get my vitamin D. I go for a walk between 6 and 7 every day, and there's no vitamin D available at that time. Even here in Durban in summer, the vitamin D window only really starts at 8:30 and it ends around 4 in the afternoon. And in winter, it's more like, 10 till 2.
Yeah, a lot of people are working for most of that time as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, it starts. So the time of day is a big deal. The latitude that you're at, if you're on the equator, then you're pretty much fine all year round. But if you're above 37 degrees latitude, you're in trouble in winter. There's, whole chunks of the year in which you can go outside with no kit on and at midday and still make no D.
I think I was happier when I didn't know that.
Well, you wanted to move to the UK.
Yeah, exactly. Choices, huh?
The other thing's altitude. So, you must have seen it. You go to the mountains and you burn easy. So the higher altitude is higher UV. Cloud cover's a big deal. I'm sure you've heard the story that, sometimes cloud cover actually increases the amount of UV available. It's true. Sometimes it does. Most of the time, it radically decreases the amount of UV. Bad news for you in the UK, but
yeah, I've seen those UV indicators. They're scary sometimes.
Yeah. So there's cloud cover, but I'm just talking about how complex this messaging is. Like, oh, you've got to watch for clouds. Yeah, but sometimes if the cloud's high, then it's not having much of an effect. But if you've got heavy low cumulonimbus clouds, then you get no UV. But then sometimes if it's partly cloudy and it's reflecting off clouds, then you have an increased UV. It's like, this is not easy public messaging.
Yeah.
And the other factors are like how old you are. So when you're 20, you make twice as much vitamin D with the same sun exposure as you will when you're 70. So things like BMI as well. So if you're overweight, you're going to need up to 4 times more vitamin D to have the same effect. And then the obvious one really is skin tone. So Fitzpatrick 1, so that's the lightest skin tone. You might need very little. You might need 5-10 minutes in the sun to max out on vitamin D, whereas Fitzpatrick 6 can need 4 or 5 times more. So you might need an hour and a half.
And that's hugely complex messaging as well.
That is hell of a complex.
Yeah.
It's like, there's no. So I think it was simpler for the government and for everyone else to just say stay out the sun. And I think, just one interruption. I was talking about mismatches in one of the other podcasts. we normally have a tanning response. As winter comes, we should be depigmenting so that we can carry on making vitamin D through the dip. And then as summer comes along, I mean, we're outside every day, right? It's not like so, and skin tone shifts in an absolutely seamless way with seasons. It's like we are excellent at changing our melanin content based on seasonal changes. Now we hide inside all day and then go walking out, blinking on the weekend and get the living shit cooked out of us.
Yeah.
And it's, or even worse, get on an airplane, leave, some high latitude space and go to freaking Ibiza or Mallorca and get cooked. It's
You are talking to the average UK citizen now. It's been my observation. That's exactly what people do. They've been living indoors for the whole of winter.
Yeah.
They hit that plane and they come back like a lobster.
Yeah.
Like literally.
That is terrible. That is a very, very bad outcome. And it would evolutionarily never have happened because you would have had this smooth tanning response the whole way through. But yeah, we've intervened again, and now we're going to have to deal with the fallout from that. So I think those are the reasons that it was just easier to say stay out the sun. But there's an app called D-Minder, and it actually at least gives you a UV index and some indication of when you should get out of the sun, and some nudge to get into the sun when vitamin D is available.
Just for me, on that, for anyone that's listening, that thing's been a game changer in my latitude because, in winter when you can't get any, it plays with your mind a bit, but what you're wearing, how much you're wearing, what time of day and how much sun you can get, you can actually regulate. So it does give you a little bit more information than you had before to make some informed, healthy sun decisions, right?
Honestly, we've got to start more and more doing that. There's an app like that, a simple app like that actually has a pretty decent calculation in it. But yeah, I think to your point that that messaging's been absolutely looked at. These like all fats are bad, or eggs lift your cholesterol, or don't eat butter, or those. The story's always more complex than these simple absolutes.
Yeah, let's not get on that track. I'll sidetrack you completely. But obviously, linking, we started off talking about the sunscreen and messaging, but this is about vitamin D, and it's obviously incredibly important. So just let's talk a little about what it does for us and why it matters.
So we spent the last, best estimates are that we spent the last 2 million years or so furless and walking upright outdoors. We're not burrowing animals. So we've been upright and walking outdoors without fur for a very, very long time. And we've now moved indoors. The average person spends 93% of their time either inside in a building or in a car.
In a podcast studio.
And I mean, so as soon as you're behind glass, you're not making vitamin D. So we don't generally perceive glass as a filter, but it is. It filters out the UVB. Not completely, but almost. It allows UVA through. I
must say, I didn't know that. And, thinking sunlight coming through a window, you think you're okay. And when I find that, that's a good portion of your vitamin D becomes ineffective.
It feels good, though. It's like because you get the warmth and you get the infrared through and you're thinking, hey, that's got to be good for me. It's a bit, but... Yeah, largely the UVB is filtered out. So UVB bounces off anything. It's super easy to reflect. So because very high energy. So it just reflects largely off glass, and on the other end you make a tiny percentage of the vitamin D that you normally would. And the same thing applies for SPF really. So the SPF is a measure of how well a sunscreen absorbs or reflects UV. So an SPF of 8 will block about 87% of the UVB, and an SPF of 30 will block about 97%. So 97% is a large chunk to lose of your vitamin D.
Even the low SPF is a fairly large chunk. So
and I mean, so then you look at how much an SPF 50 would block, and it's 98%. So in my risk reward maths. I'm kind of going like, I don't know if I'm prepared to increase my chemical load all the way to SPF 50 for a 1% increment in the amount of UV that I block.
It's very scientific of you.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, but it's true. But I mean, most people just, you've been told that UV 50 is if you're going to go in the sun and for a prolonged period, just do it. I mean, in our family, that would be the advice we would have given our kids.
Yeah.
You're on the beach.
Yeah.
You're going to burn.
Yeah.
Slap the stuff on. Just so slight digression there, like on the chemical UVB, you talked about chemical load. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, those molecules are not good for you generally. Avobenzone, octocrylene, these things are very potent hormone disruptors. There's no shortage of work on them. It's not like people don't know this. Octocrylene, for example, if you take one drop of that and put it in an Olympic swimming pool, it's enough to kill coral.
Jeez.
So if I'm putting, and when you look at the formulations, these molecules often make up 20-30% of the stuff you're putting on your face. And people are saying, oh, well, multiple pea-sized, I don't know. If it's killing coral at that level, I'm kind of reluctant to smear it over my whole body at high volume often.
How's that passed as safe then? Because, in sunscreen levels, if they have a lot of sunscreens have these chemicals, then how's that happen?
Well, they claim that the protection from skin cancer is if you don't do this, you're going to get skin cancer. So then, this risk's worth it. I don't think anyone really ever interrogates that too highly.
So they say the levels are low, the benefit is great. We can let it pass.
Yes.
Kind of.
I think, again, you've got industry having influence on government decisions. And again, the US has an outsized impact on the legislation. What happens in the US has an outsized impact on what happens in the rest of the world. But yeah, I don't know, maybe that sounds a bit cynical, but the short story is that between living indoors and sunscreen, we shouldn't be surprised to see low vitamin D levels. It's not, it shouldn't be. And you're right. It's about half or more of the industrialized world is short of vitamin D. And if you look at it on a map, it's even more disturbing. The average person in the world is below 20 nanograms per mil, which is clinically deficient. Yeah.
And that has, health effects that we're only starting to really understand now, right?
Definitely. We're speaking mostly about skin, but there's obviously systemic health impact of low vitamin D. On the skin, it's, where you're going to see thin, dry skin. You're going to see weakened barrier function. I feel like a stuck record, but still on about chronic inflammation. But vitamin D has a very strong impact on modulating your immune response. So if you're low vitamin D, you're going to expose yourself to increased risk of myriad autoimmune issues. Your immune response is not going to be modulated. I think, there are a whole lot of systemic impacts, but maybe we can get onto that a bit later. But the net effect on skin is that you're going to have a very clear pro-aging effect if you're low vitamin D in skin. Yeah.
Okay.
And skin should be high vitamin D, right? We should be making it from sun. It should be the first port of call. There should be massive levels of vitamin D in skin. And then that can, that then percolates through to the rest of the body. The idea that you can pop a pill and that will come through to skin, that's much less effective.
Well, I was going to ask that because in winter I take supplements. Are you in a place where you don't have that? So let's talk about that. So if you are taking a supplement like me in winter because you're not getting vitamin D, and there is a bit of education around that part of the world, which people are starting to equate vitamin D to health. So they know, you're not getting it.
Yes.
You've got all sorts of things like seasonal affective disorder and, but is that enough? If I'm taking a supplement?
Before I get nasty about popping a pill, I would take one also. we're not outdoors enough. We're not out. We wouldn't have built up enough vitamin D stores in summer to carry us through winter the way we would normally have. And without getting into the chemistry, we don't build up stores of other sterols that allow us to make vitamin D in winter either. And it's only really sun exposure that allows that. But I would also take a pill, but I would make sure that the dosages were sensible. I don't agree with very high dose, irregular vitamin D consumption. I don't think we're evolutionarily capable of I mean, some of these guys are 100,000 IU. I don't understand. There's no natural source of anything that has anywhere near that level of vitamin D, and we're not designed to take this vitamin orally.
Those levels.
Yeah.
So it's like spikes. It's like sugar spikes in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. So and what's hard to measure is that that spike. I mean, vitamin D controls calcium homeostasis. So you would suddenly have a spike in blood calcium, and that's going to deposit somewhere, right? That's probably going to deposit on the insides of arteries and cause locus for buildup of plaque, and you don't want that. It's not something that's going to be immediately apparent. We spoke in some of the other podcasts about long-term studies. I can't see too many people having the drive to do a 10-15 year study on high vitamin D usage 10 years ago having an impact on atherosclerosis 15 years later. But back to the point, is popping a pill enough? The NIH did a study on 26,000 adults. That's a lot of people. And these people for 5 years either had a vitamin D supplement or a placebo. And the lead author at the end of it said, well, we found no benefits whatsoever to vitamin D consumption.
That's quite scary.
It is. Yeah. It's not, it's that. And I think it's back to this oversimplification. I mean, humans always try to find this narrative that works for them. But in reality, there's normally complexity that makes it more difficult. And I think we've done that with D3. So vitamin D3 is critical. But I think a lot of the health benefits of D3, it's just the thing we measure. You can measure 25-hydroxy vitamin D in blood, and it is relatively stable, and it does give you an indication of the vitamin D stores. So it's a good proxy. But what it's a proxy for is questionable. When you eat vitamin D, it goes through your liver and becomes 25-hydroxy D, so you can measure it. So you can say, I ate the pill, the 25-hydroxy D in my blood increased.
Increases it, yeah.
And quickly. The thing is, what should be happening is that you should have the precursor, 7-dehydrocholesterol, so call it provitamin D. Sun should be hitting that and producing three things. Vitamin D3, about 26% of it, and two other sterols, lumisterol and tachysterol. So let's call them L3 and T3 because it's easier. So those two should make up the other 74%. It's not a trivial amount.
It's a big proportion of that amount.
So there are two brilliant researchers, one Robert Tuckey from he lives in Perth, Australia, and Andrei Slaminsky, who's in Birmingham, Alabama, in the US. And the two of them have shown now that this vitamin D narrative is not correct. That both lumisterol and tachysterol, L3 and T3, are highly biologically active. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the time circulating in your bloodstream, as you would anticipate, you've got more lumisterol than you do vitamin D. And these things, and they're hydroxylating in the same way. They're having as much of a biological effect as vitamin D.
So if I'm taking vitamin D tablets and let's say, it is mildly effective, I'm still not getting those other two sterols.
No, those other two sterols are very unstable. I mean, the tachosterol in particular, we keep it at minus 80 degrees under argon. It's, and even then it's a pain in the ass to work with. It's like, so because it breaks down so quickly. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but there's definitely, it's definitely more complexity to the story.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as just popping a pill. So does that mean like we're screwed
No.
if we live in those areas that don't have sun in winter? Because you can kind of paints a picture that's not so nice.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've been working on for a long time, and I mean, you're not screwed. I think the average person can, if you want to really craft it, get out in the sun. And it happens quite quickly. Like you start making vitamin D as soon as you get hit by sun rays. And it's literally directly proportional. So the more skin you expose, the better. So yeah, I mean, but there are vitamin D winters, and there are some religions that advocate for very little skin exposure, and there are a lot of people that are very concerned about tanning, that don't want that tanning response, that prefer light skin.
Actually, a large proportion of people in the world make up those last two you talked about. So
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. I don't think that a lot of people know what vitamin D actually does for skin. So do you want to just talk a little bit about what it does?
Yeah, so I mean, in the absence of vitamin D, you have very thin skin. So what vitamin D does is it uses a calcium gradient to very carefully time how skin cells differentiate as they get to the surface. So, and also control the rate of production largely. So there's this, in the absence of vitamin D, you're going to have skin not knowing really how quickly, how to maintain its thickness. So you'll generally find thinner skin, which is not a great result. It, like I said, it balances the immune response, so your skin will be less reactive if your vitamin D stores are substantive. It boosts T-junction formation, so you'll have better barrier function, and we've spoken at length about that. I think those are the key drivers of skin health. There are others, but yeah. Largely keeping toxins out, keeping toxins and pathogens out, and keeping moisture in is going to make skin look plumper.
So it actually plays a big role in fundamental skin health, and you can't almost disconnect it from the other pieces we've been talking about. And we have been talking about sensitivity and aging. So I can imagine it plays a big role in those areas.
Yeah, definitely. Thinner, poor barrier function, more inflammation with low D. So a lot of people that feel they have very sensitive skin may just be vitamin D deficient. I do think testing is worth it. It'll, like I said, that 25 hydroxy blood serum vitamin D is not a perfect measure, but it's the best proxy we have. It's not that expensive. It's not that time consuming to just go and get an idea of what your vitamin D is, and just understand, I mean, maybe you're fine, in which case at least you can put that one to bed and go, hey, I'm at 40 nanograms per mil and I'm fine. Like I don't have to worry. So yeah, I would definitely advocate for people just finding out. All of a sudden starting to. There was a guy, Michael Hollick, who was, there was a very serious smear campaign put out on him. He's a really good researcher, but his messaging wasn't appreciated by the Sunscreen guys, and they put a pretty serious smear campaign on him because he was also advocating for testing, but he had an interest in. He was a consultant for one of the vitamin D testing companies, and they made it out that he was advocating for testing so that he could benefit from all of this, which he wasn't really. But all of a sudden I'm starting to think, geez, do I have any interests in the testing side?
You better declare it on the podcast. I have no interest in
I have no interest in any vitamin D tests.
Interesting thing about aging, though, if you think about, because people don't connect all of these dots. If you were someone that was staying out of the sun because of the sun's aging effects, you could actually have the opposite result if you could age more. Just apart from I know aging and health are related now. So, but you could be aging more. So that's a kind of a double whammy, right?
Yeah, I mean it's again, it's just the overexposure is bad. That means zero is good. Is a pretty crazy idea when looked at through a scientific lens. There's an optimum somewhere in the middle. Where that is probably depends on skin tone, genetics.
We were talking about earlier about all the variables.
Yeah, but there's it's not zero. From a perfect aging outcome is definitely to have some healthy sun exposure, and I think in general people would err on the side of too little, given the current vitamin D status of the average person.
Yeah. Stats certainly seem to indicate that.
Yeah.
Just in terms of what it does for the body, though, because we've talked about the skin, and obviously these are primarily skin podcasts, but this is all interlinked and seems like it has really important roles it plays in our body beyond skin.
Yeah, I mean, So the first thing you'll probably notice is just decreased muscle function. So you just feel slightly weak, which is kind of hard to pinpoint. It's not that easy to go, oh, I'm low D because I'm feeling a little tired, or it has a meaningful impact on your cardiovascular health. Like I said, it maintains blood serum calcium levels, which is pretty critical, but there are also other effects that it has on cardiovascular health. Mood regulation, it's again difficult to figure whether it's the vitamin D or the sun itself, but there's definitely a mood link. Even with supplemental vitamin D, weird stuff like it impacting on the gut microbiome. Like you wouldn't expect vitamin D to have an impact on that, but it's quite a meaningful impact. And I saw a paper from 2017, so it's not new knowledge that it has this impact, and it's quite a chunky one. But yeah, it is pretty much a non-negotiable. You've got to have decent vitamin D if you're going to optimize your underlying health. Yeah.
It's a hard balance to get right. But so how do we get that balance?
Look, we definitely need some sun. I think it's just about short, regular sessions. Make sure I always tell my kids, get your meds, your minimum erythemal dose. So what you don't want to do is go and lie on the beach for 3 hours without turning. Actually, you don't want to lie on the beach for 3 hours, full stop.
If my daughter's listening, please listen specifically to this part. Yeah.
If you look at the saturation, at the end of 20 minutes, you've probably, if you're in the zone, depending obviously on the UV index, but if you're in that UV index of 8 zone, at the end of 20 minutes, it's as good as it's going to get. At that point, vitamin D is starting to break down as fast as you're making it. So after the 20 minutes, it's not all downside, but a lot of it's downside after that. So if you can get in the sun for 20 minutes around midday it doesn't have to be every day, even probably 3 times a week. It's going to cater for a large chunk of what you need. Like I said, you don't want to burn ever. I think that, again, just to drive people back to that app, again, which I have absolutely no financial interest in doing, but it's just been a useful tool for me personally to go, hey, what's the UV index? I don't use it in its full capacity anymore. I don't use it to monitor my, project my vitamin D or any of that. I just want to know, I've got to the point where I can look at the UV index and go, oh, okay, I need 15 minutes. And then I set a timer. I think there's value in that, because it takes out some of the nuance of what Fitzpatrick skin type you are, and what it at least knows what your latitude is and whether it's cloudy or not.
And that's kind of how I use it as well. And like you say, we've got no vested interest in the app, but it does say what are you wearing, so the amount of skin exposure you have tells you the UV index, and it lets you. I just use it to figure out, how many IU I'm getting a day. So I can basically track it. And if you're being scientific, it also lets you put in your vitamin D supplementation. So it could say how much supplementation you're taking. So it gives you a nice there or thereabouts if you're really low or really high. So that's kind of how I use it in winter specifically. In terms of, I thought it was interesting about the body's response and storing some of those sterols that you can use later, but a large portion of Europe, and you can see I'm thinking about me a lot of here, is, has this vitamin D winter. So what about that? I mean...
Yeah, so the line is 37 degrees. So 37 degrees north or south, you're going to start having a vitamin D winter. So I think the capital of Cyprus is Nicosia. So they have a 4-day vitamin D winter because they're pretty much on that line. But if you're going to like Boston, it's like 5 months of the year. And if you go to Oslo, they're at 187 days. So they're more than half of the year you can't make vitamin D. I would go on holiday if I lived there, but there's definitely merit in looking for alternatives at that point. Hollick suggested sunbeds. I don't know what I feel about that one. There's a lot of UVA in some of those lamps, which I don't think is a great outcome. I don't know what I would do if I lived there. I mean, Durban's at 30 degrees, so like I said, and even in winter, we're between 10 and 2, we can still make plenty of vitamin D. But it's hard yards, and like I said, you aren't building up reserves of the other sterols during summer because we're not outside enough. But if I lived in above 37, I'd definitely try get out in summer, definitely, and then
and build up those reserves so that they can convert when you've got the UVA.
Yeah. But it's hard to get. I mean, I don't know. I've lived in Ireland for a little while, and geez, it's hard to get out. It's cold, man. It's miserable most of the time. And I know I could be converting some tachosterol, but there's no chance I'm taking my freaking shirt off.
Exactly. Yeah. If anything, you're putting another jacket on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also easier in some of the places in Europe, like if you go to Scandinavia, it's cold, but the sun is shining. In places like the UK and Ireland, which you're talking about, it's cold and it's the clouds are there for most of the time. Anytime it goes above 7 degrees, it's raining. Don't ask me about my life choices. But thinking about that, we've talked a little bit about this paradox. Obviously, you certainly aren't advocating not using sunscreen. That's really clear. But it's this paradox of protection versus getting enough. How do we balance that for the average person out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I think. I mean, look, you heard my predisposition toward mineral-based sunscreen. I don't think that the SPF requirement should be that high. This idea that the higher the SPF, the better. And I'm probably going to get roasted for this, but I don't see why it's a terrible thing to have an SPF of 8. I mean, if you're blocking 87% of the UV with an SPF of 8, well, then maybe that's not a bad result, right? Like, I want to go outside. I still want to make some vitamin D. So we've looked at, we actually formulated the lowest SPF that you're allowed to formulate is an SPF of 6. And we formulated a really nice mineral sunblock at SPF 6. And we were going to launch it. And geez, the feedback from the first world was not good. They were like,
just too low.
What are you trying to do? They're like this. You calling this a sunscreen? People are going to laugh at you. It's because, and I think. Yeah, but I think it might be a reasonable call. But personally, so I tell you what I did. I make it for myself and my family. So there's and it's comfortable to wear, and it stops the burn, and it allows you to spend time in the sun while still making some vitamin D. I think the alternative, I guess, is to go out into the sun. And I mean, a lot of people are going to go out, like I said, work inside all week and then go out on the weekend. Maybe go out and then do the first 20 minutes with no sunscreen and then apply.
That's what I do.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that was good or bad. I was going to ask you because it seems to make sense to me. If you're reasonable, if you are going out to burn, like people go to the beach day, and especially in Europe, but everywhere, even here, we used to do it. You go out to be on the beach and be all day. That's not sensible. If you slam on 50, it probably, people still will do that because they know they're going to do that. But if you're just going out, first 20 minutes you don't have anything on and then you put sunscreen on.
Yeah. I think
could be getting the best of both worlds, right?
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good result. And as I said, it's evolutionarily unprecedented that we would hide in the cave, and then in one day we suddenly just go outside all day with almost no clothing on.
Yeah.
So, and those burning events, by the way, I mean, you look at stuff that drives cancer, those big burn events, that drives cancer and massive aging. It's pulling the biggest trick on your skin you could ever pull. You look at how beautifully those melanocytes literally make like tiny umbrellas over the nucleus of the cell to protect it from UV damage. And I mean, there are these highly, highly evolved mechanisms to protect us from sun. We short circuit all of them and then trick like surprise.
Yeah. The problem is humans are humans, right? If they want to have a cheat meal, they're going to have a cheat meal.
Yeah.
I've noticed observation, again, I'll probably get roasted for this one, is that when people go on holiday, where I am currently now, they actually like to burn because it's a sign that they were out of the country.
Yeah.
And I watched people at the airports and I go, these people are not, but it's almost, they come in and I've actually had it where people go, oh yeah, I went here. And it's that red skin as a sign of that. So I think, humans are humans and we all kind of know, I think what we're talking today about is making a lot of sense. But it's much easier just to, do the one rule, slap on sunscreen, don't do it. In fact, I saw a thing recently which just talks about how this works. Is a crew that in my industry started a sunscreen in Australia called Slather.
Okay.
And they created a monster out of the sun. So the whole thing is they called it Slather, and they were advocating skin cancers on the rise. Slather the stuff, never go out without it because the sun. And I guess that's the, it was actually quite a nice piece of creative work, but it's exactly what that thing is. It's taking that to the nth degree and using that fear to stop people maybe thinking about the healthy balance.
It's just it's very prevalent, and I guess that's the competition, is how scared can you make people so that they buy. Yeah.
So any final advice before we wrap up?
Like I said, don't burn. Get back in the sun, man. Like it's not a monster. We've disrupted things, but so just be sensible when you get back in. And consider testing, I'd say, and also if you're going on holiday, just be conscious of what latitude it might be at and what the UV index might be there. I very, very much doubt. I mean, there's not much scientific literature to back this up, but I just very much doubt that the optimum level of sun exposure is 0. We haven't evolved as vampires or like something that hides in a cave all day. We probably need at least some sun. And I think getting to that optimal is going to be pretty critical to long-term health.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think it's a lot of people wouldn't have thought about that. And I hadn't until I started interacting with you about it. And it actually made quite a big difference. So anyone listening out there, just be sensible and get in the sun once in a while. Thanks, Trevor. That's again really interesting.
Geoff. Cheers.